My name is Margaret, and I want to tell you about the day my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye, smiled that tight little smile she always saves for moments she wants to hurt me, and said, "This wedding isn't for everyone, Margaret." I remember exactly where I was standing, in my own kitchen, the one I had scrubbed 100 times before hosting family dinners, the one where I had taught her how to make my mother's pot roast recipe, the very first Christmas she joined our family. I remember the smell of coffee brewing behind me, and I remember how my hands went cold even though the mug I was holding was still warm. She wasn't talking about some stranger's wedding, she was talking about her own sister's wedding, a wedding my son, her husband, was supposed to attend, a wedding that somehow, in the span of one conversation, I had been quietly uninvited from. Not my son, not my grandchildren, just me, the mother who raised the man she married. The woman who watched her walk down the aisle 5 years ago and cried tears of joy because I believed, foolishly, that she would become another daughter to me. I stood there in my kitchen holding my coffee, waiting for her to laugh, to say she was joking, to tell me it was some kind of misunderstanding. But she didn't. She just picked up her purse, adjusted her sunglasses like she was leaving a business meeting instead of ending a relationship with the woman who had welcomed her into this family with open arms, and walked out the door without so much as a goodbye. I stood frozen in that kitchen for what felt like an hour, though I'm sure it was only minutes, replaying every interaction we'd ever had, searching for the moment where I had failed her, where I had done something so unforgivable that I no longer deserved a seat at a family celebration. I couldn't find it, because there wasn't one. There was no falling out, no explosive argument, no moment where I had crossed a line. There was only her, Vanessa, deciding, quietly and without explanation, that I was no longer worth including. And the worst part wasn't even the exclusion itself. The worst part was the silence that followed. My son didn't call, he didn't text. 3 days passed, and I heard nothing from the boy I raised alone after his father left us when he was only 7 years old. The boy I worked 2 jobs to keep fed and clothed. The boy I stayed up nights helping with homework at a kitchen table, not unlike the one I'd been standing at when his wife delivered her verdict. 3 days of silence from my own son felt heavier than anything Vanessa could have said to my face. I told myself he probably didn't know. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe this was some kind of miscommunication that would resolve itself once he found out what his wife had done. I wanted so badly to believe that my son, the boy who used to leave notes on my pillow telling me I was the best mom in the world, hadn't simply let his wife erase me from his life without even a conversation. So I waited. I busied myself with things that no longer mattered. Folding laundry that didn't need folding. Rearranging photo albums filled with pictures of birthdays and holidays that suddenly felt like relics of a family that didn't exist anymore. I looked at pictures of Vanessa and me laughing together at Thanksgiving, pictures of her holding my hand at her own wedding reception and calling me, Mom, in front of 200 guests, and I wondered how someone could hold your hand one year and slam a door on you the next. And then, 2 days after that conversation in my kitchen, 2 days after being told I wasn't welcome at a wedding that involved my own family, my phone rang. It was Vanessa, not my son, her. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since the early years of raising my son alone, back when every unexpected phone call meant some new crisis I had to solve by myself. But something in me, maybe hope, maybe habit, maybe the simple exhausting instinct of a mother who has spent her whole life answering when someone needs her, made me press the green button. Her voice came through cheerful light, as if 2 days earlier she hadn't shattered something inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't even acknowledge what she'd said in my kitchen. Instead, she asked how I was doing, made small talk about the weather, mentioned something about the kids needing new shoes for school, and then, without missing a beat, without even the slightest hesitation in her tone, she asked me for $1,200, from the woman who 2 days prior had made it clear in no uncertain terms that I wasn't worth including in her family's most important moments. I sat there holding the phone, staring at nothing, feeling something shift inside me, something that had been simmering quietly for years finally beginning to rise to the surface. Because in that single phone call, I understood something I hadn't let myself see before. This wasn't about a wedding. This had never been about a wedding. This was about what I meant to this family, and more specifically, what I was worth to them. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not as a person who had sacrificed everything to build this family from nothing, but as a resource, a wallet, someone to be excluded when convenient and called upon when necessary. And as I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where she had ended things 2 days before, gripping that phone with white knuckles, I made a decision that would change everything that came after. A decision that Vanessa, and even my own son, never saw coming. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch just a beat too long, long enough that I heard Vanessa shift on the other end of the line. Long enough that I heard her clear her throat the way people do when they sense the ground beneath them isn't quite as solid as they assumed. "Margaret, are you there?" she asked, her voice still carrying that same practiced brightness, as if 2 days earlier she hadn't looked me in the eye in my own kitchen, and told me I wasn't welcome at a wedding involving my own family. I finally spoke, and I kept my voice level, calm, the same tone I used decades ago, when my son would come to me with some catastrophe that felt like the end of the world to him, but was, to me, simply another Tuesday in the life of a single mother holding everything together. "I'm here," I said, and then I waited. I wanted to see if she would bring it up herself. The wedding, the words she'd said, the door she'd walked out of without so much as a backward glance. But she didn't. She barreled forward instead, explaining that the caterer needed a deposit, that her sister was stressed about the budget, that things had gotten complicated with the venue, and that she just needed a little help to smooth things over. $1,200, she said again, like it was nothing, like it was the kind of favor you ask a friend for when splitting a dinner bill, not a request aimed at a woman she had just humiliated in her own home. I thought about all the years I had said yes to her. The time she needed help with a down payment on their first apartment, and I emptied part of my savings without hesitation because that's what family does. The time she called me sobbing after a miscarriage, and I drove 3 hours in the middle of the night just to sit with her, because I loved her like my own daughter. The time I babysat for free for 8 straight months so she could finish her nursing certification, canceling my own plans, my own life, without a second thought, because I believed, truly believed, that I was building something with her, not simply being used by her. I thought about all of that in the space of maybe 4 seconds, and then I asked her the only question that mattered. "Vanessa," I said, "why would you exclude me from a wedding 2 days ago, and then call me today asking for money?" The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't a silence of confusion. It wasn't a silence of someone caught off guard by an unfair accusation. It was the silence of someone who had been caught, plain and simple, the kind of silence that comes right before someone tries to talk their way out of something they know they can't justify. "It's not like that," she finally said. Though she couldn't quite explain what it was actually like, she mumbled something about the wedding being small and intimate, about her sister wanting to keep the guest list tight, about how it had nothing to do with me personally. But here's the thing about lies, even rehearsed ones. They rarely survive contact with specifics, because if the guest list truly was small and intimate, why did I already know, through my own son's cousin who had let it slip weeks earlier, without realizing it was supposed to be a secret, that the wedding had over 100 guests, including co-workers of Vanessa's sister that neither my son nor I had ever even met? If it truly had nothing to do with me personally, why was I the only member of our immediate family who had been excluded, while my son, her own husband, was still expected to attend? I didn't say any of this to her yet. I wanted to see how far she would take the lie before I confronted her with what I actually knew, and she took it further than I expected. She said that maybe, if things worked out, if I was willing to help with the deposit, there might be a way to figure something out about the wedding after all, as if my presence at a family event was a transaction to be negotiated, a privilege to be purchased, rather than a place I should have held simply by virtue of being the grandmother of the flower girl, the mother of the groom's best man, the woman who had spent Christmas mornings for the last 5 years watching her open presents at my own dining room table. That's when something in me went very quiet and very clear. I have spent my whole life giving to this family without asking questions, without keeping score, without ever once making anyone feel like my love came with conditions attached. And here was Vanessa, calling me 2 days after telling me I wasn't good enough to attend a wedding, essentially telling me that my worth to this family could be measured in dollar signs. That inclusion could be bought, that my place at the table was negotiable if the price was right. I told her I needed to think about it. She sounded relieved, thanking me, saying she knew she could count on me, saying it like those words from 2 days earlier had simply evaporated into nothing. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall, feeling something harden inside me that had never been hard before. Because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't thinking about how to fix things for everyone else. I was thinking about what I actually deserved, and I realized that before I gave Vanessa a single answer about that $1,200, there was someone else I needed to talk to first. My son. And when I finally reached him that evening, what he told me changed everything I thought I understood about what had really been happening in my family behind my back. I called my son that evening, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my hands were shaking as I dialed his number. Not because I was afraid of him. I had never once been afraid of my own child, the boy I had rocked to sleep through countless fevers, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose heart I had helped mend after his first breakup, whose graduation I had cried through alone in the 3rd row because his father hadn't bothered to show up. I was shaking because I didn't know which version of my son would answer the phone. Would it be the son who had gone silent for 3 days while his wife excluded his own mother from a family wedding, or would it be the son I actually raised, the one who used to tell people proudly unprompted that his mother was the strongest person he knew? He picked up on the 3rd ring, and his voice sounded tired, distracted, the way it always did when he was juggling work and the kids and whatever chaos Vanessa had going on that week. "Hey, Mom," he said, and there was nothing in his tone that suggested he knew anything was wrong, which struck me immediately as strange. If Vanessa had truly discussed excluding me from the wedding with him, if this had been a joint decision the two of them made together, wouldn't there be some trace of guilt in his voice, some hesitation, some awareness that his mother might have questions? Instead, he sounded like a man who had no idea his mother's heart had been quietly broken in her own kitchen 2 days earlier. So I asked him directly. I didn't dance around it, because I have never been a woman who dances around hard conversations. Life never gave me the luxury of avoidance. I asked him if he knew that Vanessa had told me I wasn't welcome at her sister's wedding. There was a pause. A real one, not a guilty one, but the pause of someone genuinely processing information for the first time. "What are you talking about?" he asked, and I could hear something shift in his voice, something sharpening. "Mom, you're on the guest list. You've been on the guest list since March. I saw the seating chart myself last week. You're at table 4 with Aunt Carol." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spent countless nights helping him with homework, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way it hadn't even during Vanessa's phone call. Because if I was still on the guest list, if my own son had seen my name written into the seating arrangement just days before his wife stood in my kitchen and told me the wedding wasn't for everyone, then the conversation I'd had 2 days ago wasn't about the wedding at all. It had never been about the wedding. My son asked me to explain everything, and so I did. Every word Vanessa had said, the tightness of her smile, the coldness in her eyes, the way she'd walked out without so much as a goodbye. I told him about the phone call 2 days later, about the $1,200, about the way she dangled my attendance at the wedding like a bargaining chip, like something I now had to purchase back after being told I wasn't wanted. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I asked if he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. It was low, controlled, the voice he used when he was genuinely angry but trying not to let it show, a voice I recognized because it was, in many ways, my own voice, the one I'd used raising him alone, the one that came from a lifetime of learning to control your fury, because falling apart was never an option when you were the only adult in the room. He told me he needed to talk to Vanessa, and he hung up before I could say anything else. I sat there in my kitchen holding a phone that had gone silent, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief because my son, despite everything, hadn't betrayed me the way I feared he might have. Dread because I now understood that whatever was happening in his marriage, whatever motivated Vanessa to lie to my face, and then call me 2 days later asking for money, was bigger and uglier than a simple miscommunication about a guest list. This wasn't carelessness. This was calculated. She had banked on me not talking to my son before agreeing to give her the money. She had banked on my hurt feelings keeping me quiet, on my instinct to avoid conflict, on the same pattern of behavior that had defined our entire relationship, me giving, her taking, both of us pretending it was love. But she had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that after being hurt, I would retreat into silence the way I always had before. She didn't count on me picking up the phone and asking questions. She didn't count on my son actually caring enough to find out the truth. And she certainly didn't count on what happened next, because 2 hours later, my phone rang again, and this time, it wasn't Vanessa's cheerful, rehearsed voice on the other end. It was her crying, her words tumbling out too fast to fully understand at first, and buried somewhere in that frantic apology was an admission that revealed exactly why she had lied to me in my own kitchen. A reason that had nothing to do with wedding guest lists and everything to do with money she had already spent, money she desperately needed to replace before anyone else in the family found out what she had done. I let the phone ring twice before I answered, not out of spite, but because I needed those extra few seconds to steady myself for whatever was coming. When I finally picked up, Vanessa was already crying. Not the polished, controlled tears I'd occasionally seen her produce during past family disagreements, but something rawer, messier, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has run out of options and doesn't know what else to do except confess. "Margaret, I'm so sorry," she said, her words tripping over each other. "I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't think you'd find out. I didn't think Michael would check the seating chart. I just needed time to fix things before anyone noticed." I sat quietly, letting her talk, because I had learned decades ago that the fastest way to get to the truth is to stop filling silences for other people. And slowly, piece by piece, the real story came out. There had never been any plan to exclude me from the wedding. That part, at least, had been true when my son said it. I was on the guest list, I had a seat at table 4. Nothing about the wedding itself had changed. What had changed was Vanessa's financial situation, and it had changed badly, she admitted, through broken sentences and long pauses, that she and my son had been struggling with money for months. Struggling in a way neither of them had shared with me, out of pride, out of embarrassment, out of the same stubbornness I recognized, because I had lived with a version of it myself for years after my husband left. She'd taken out a loan for the wedding, using money that was meant for the caterer as an investment. She thought would double before the final payments were due, on the encouragement of a coworker who had talked about some trading opportunity. The investment had failed. The money was gone, and she needed $1,200 in 5 days, or she would have to explain to her sister, the bride, that she couldn't cover what she had promised to contribute toward the reception, something she had bragged about to the entire family months earlier, as a way of proving she had her life together. The story about excluding me from the wedding, she admitted through fresh tears, was never really about the wedding at all. It was about creating distance. She thought that if she pushed me away first, if she made me feel unwanted and hurt, I would be less likely to ask questions when she came to me for money later. Because a woman nursing a fresh wound doesn't usually interrogate the person who hurt her. She thought hurt would make me compliant. She thought guilt or grief, or the desperate hope of reconciliation, would make me hand over $1,200 without a single question. The same way I had handed over money and time and love for years without ever once asking what it cost me. I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling something inside me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sadness, but a strange, clarifying combination of both, because in that confession was the truest picture I had ever gotten of how Vanessa saw me, not as a mother, in law to be respected, not as a partner in raising a family, but as a resource to be managed, a source of money that could be turned on or off depending on how she played her cards. And the saddest part wasn't even her scheme. The saddest part was how well she understood me, how accurately she had predicted my behavior, how confident she had been that decades of unconditional giving had made me an easy target rather than a woman who might finally say no. I asked her, calmly, why she hadn't simply come to me and asked for help honestly, explained the situation, trusted me the way family is supposed to trust each other. Her answer told me more than anything else that night. She said she was embarrassed. She said she didn't want me to think less of her, didn't want my son's mother to see her as someone who couldn't manage money, someone who had made a foolish decision with funds that weren't fully hers to gamble with. In trying to protect her pride, she had chosen manipulation over honesty, cruelty over vulnerability, and in doing so, she had shown me exactly who she really was when she thought no one was paying close enough attention to notice. I told her I needed time to think, and I hung up the phone gently, without anger in my voice, because the fire in me wasn't the kind that needed to be loud to be felt. I sat in my kitchen for a long time that night, turning over every version of this family I had believed in. The woman who called me Mom at her wedding, the years of holidays and babysitting and quiet sacrifices I never once resented, the granddaughter who called me Nini and ran into my arms every time I visited. None of that had been a lie. But the way Vanessa had learned to use my love as leverage. That was something I couldn't unknow now, and something I couldn't simply forgive with a hug and a check written out for $1,200. Over the next 2 days, I made a decision that surprised even me, one that would force Vanessa to face consequences she never expected, and one that would finally show my son the truth about the woman he had married. A truth that was about to unfold in a family dinner neither of them would ever forget. I didn't call Vanessa back that night, and I didn't call her the next morning either. Instead, I spent those 2 days doing something I hadn't done in years. I sat with my own feelings instead of rushing to soothe someone else's. I thought about the $1,200, and I thought about what it actually represented. It wasn't really about the money. I had that much sitting in savings without blinking, and if she had come to me honestly, embarrassed but truthful, I would have handed it over without a second thought, the same way I always had. What I couldn't get past was the calculation behind it. The fact that she had looked at decades of my love and seen not a relationship but a resource with a predictable trigger, hurt me first, then ask, because a wounded woman rarely says no. That wasn't a slip of judgment made in a moment of panic. That was a strategy, built on years of watching me give and never push back. So on the 3rd day, I invited my son and Vanessa to dinner. I made it sound ordinary. Pot roast, the same recipe I'd taught her all those years ago, nothing that would put either of them on guard. My son arrived first, kissing my cheek, still carrying the tightness in his jaw that had been there since our phone call days earlier. Vanessa came in quieter than usual, her eyes red, rimmed, clearly expecting some kind of confrontation but not knowing what shape it would take. I let them eat first. I let there be normal conversation about the kids, about work, about the wedding preparations that were somehow still moving forward despite everything unraveling underneath them. And then, once the plates were cleared, I told them both, calmly, exactly what I had decided. I told Vanessa I would give her the $1,200, not as a favor and not as forgiveness handed out cheaply, but as a loan, with a written agreement, repaid on a schedule, like the transaction she had already turned it into the moment she chose manipulation over honesty. I watched her face shift from relief to something more uncomfortable as I continued, because relief was not the only thing I had prepared. I told her that I loved her, that I always had, that the years we'd shared weren't erased by one desperate lie. But I also told her, in front of my son, that I would never again be someone whose love could be weaponized as a means to an end. If she needed help, she could ask me directly, honestly, the way family is supposed to ask family, not through cruelty designed to make me too wounded to question her. I told her that the version of me who absorbed hurt silently and gave anyway, no questions asked, no boundaries drawn, was gone, retired, replaced by a woman who had spent one long, sleepless night finally understanding her own worth. My son sat there quietly through most of it, but when I finished, he reached over and took Vanessa's hand, not in the defensive way I feared he might, but gently, as if steadying her for what he said next. He told her that what she had done wasn't just about the money, and it wasn't just about hurting his mother. It was about the kind of marriage he wanted to have, one built on honesty, not manufactured wounds and hidden failures. He told her that if she ever felt embarrassed or scared about money again, she needed to come to him first, not construct elaborate lies that hurt the people who loved her most. Vanessa cried through most of it, but this time, the tears felt different, less performative. More like someone finally confronting the parts of herself she'd been avoiding. She apologized to me again, this time without any request tucked beneath it, And for the first time since that conversation in my kitchen, I believed her. Not completely, not enough to forget what had happened, but enough to believe that something real had shifted at that table. The wedding happened 3 weeks later, and I sat at table 4 exactly where I was always meant to be, watching Vanessa's sister marry a kind man who made a beautiful toast about family showing up for each other even when it's hard. Vanessa found me afterward, during the reception, and thanked me, not for the money, which she was steadily repaying on the schedule we'd agreed to, but for not simply writing her off the way she probably would have deserved. She told me she had spent the last 3 weeks thinking about the woman she wanted to become, the kind of mother-in-law she hoped to be herself one day, and she didn't want it to be someone who used fear and guilt as tools to get what she needed. I don't know if everything is perfectly healed between us. Trust, once cracked, takes far longer to rebuild than it takes to break, and I'm not foolish enough to believe one honest dinner erased years of learned behavior on either side. But I do know this: I am no longer the woman who gives without asking questions, who absorbs hurt silently because speaking up feels like too much trouble, who lets people mistake my kindness for an unlimited resource with no boundaries attached. My daughter-in-law learned that lesson the hard way, in my kitchen, over pot roast and $1,200, and I learned something too, that it is never too late, at any age, to finally understand exactly what you deserve, and to demand it, quietly but firmly, from the people who are supposed to love you the most. If you're still watching this, I want to speak to you directly for a moment, because I know some of you have lived some version of this story yourselves. Maybe it wasn't $1,200. Maybe it was your time, your patience, your silence swallowed down at family dinners while everyone else got to speak their mind. Maybe it was years of being the one who always gave in first, always forgave first, always showed up first, while quietly wondering when someone was finally going to show up for you. I want you to hear this clearly: love and boundaries are not opposites. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother-in-law, a good grandmother, meant saying yes to everything, absorbing every hurt quietly, never making anyone uncomfortable with my own needs. I thought that was strength. I thought silence was grace. But I learned, sitting alone in my kitchen after being told I wasn't welcome at a family wedding, that there is a difference between loving people generously and allowing people to treat your love as something they never have to earn or respect. Vanessa didn't wake up one day and decide to become someone who manipulates the people around her. She learned, slowly, over years, that my love came with no conditions and no pushback, and people, even people who love us, will often take exactly as much as we allow them to take. That isn't cruelty on their part alone. It's partly on us, the ones who never taught the people around us where the line was, because we were too afraid that drawing a line meant losing love altogether. I want you to understand something I had to learn the hard way, at an age when I thought I already knew everything about family, about sacrifice, about love. Setting a boundary is not the same as closing your heart. I didn't stop loving Vanessa when I told her the truth at that dinner table. I didn't love my son any less when I let the silence sit heavy on the phone instead of rushing to reassure him everything was fine. If anything, I loved them both more honestly than I ever had before, because for the first time, they were seeing the real me. Not the endlessly accommodating version I performed to keep the peace, but the woman underneath, the one with limits, the one with dignity. The one who had spent a lifetime giving and had finally decided she deserved honesty in return. So if you are sitting somewhere right now, nursing a wound someone in your own family gave you, a daughter-in-law, a son, a sister, anyone who has learned that your kindness is a door they can walk through without knocking, I want you to know it is never too late to change the pattern. You do not have to become bitter to become boundaried. You do not have to stop loving people to stop letting them use you. You simply have to decide, the way I decided that night in my kitchen with a phone in my hand and $1,200 hanging in the air between us, that your worth is not measured by how much you're willing to sacrifice without complaint. It is measured by how honestly you are treated by the people who claim to love you, and by how honestly you are willing, finally, to treat yourself. My family is not perfect. Vanessa and I are still rebuilding something that cracked in ways I don't think either of us fully understood until it happened. But we are rebuilding it on steadier ground now, ground made of truth instead of quiet resentment, ground made of boundaries instead of endless accommodation. And if there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it is this: showing up for your family does not mean disappearing for yourself. You can love people fiercely and still expect to be treated with respect. You can give generously and still say no when something asks too much of you. And you can forgive people for their mistakes without pretending those mistakes never cost you anything. I am still Nini to my granddaughter. I am still mom to my son. And I am, finally, after all these years, someone Vanessa has to be honest with, not because she fears losing my help, but because she has learned, the hard way, that my love was never something to be manipulated. It was simply something she had to earn the same way anyone earns real family: through truth, through respect, and through showing up, even when showing up is hard. There's a moment that comes to every woman who has spent her life giving more than she ever received. A moment when she finally stops asking, "What did I do wrong?" and starts asking, "What do I deserve?" That moment came for me in a kitchen, over a phone call about $1,200, but I have come to believe it comes for all of us eventually, in one form or another, whether it's a daughter, in-law, a husband, a friend, or even our own children. Someone, somewhere, will eventually test the limits of what we're willing to accept in the name of love. And how we answer that test says more about who we are than any amount of quiet sacrifice ever could. I think back now to the woman I was before all of this happened. The woman who taught Vanessa my mother's pot roast recipe with such joy, who cried tears of happiness watching her walk down the aisle, who genuinely believed that if I simply loved hard enough, gave generously enough, and asked for nothing in return, I would be protected from ever being hurt by the people I loved most. I understand now how naive that belief was, not because love isn't powerful, but because love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's an open invitation for people to take without ever having to consider the cost. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with the clarity of a woman who has finally learned, later in life than she would have liked, that respect is not something you earn by disappearing into everyone else's needs. It is something you claim by insisting, calmly and firmly, that you matter too. What happened in my family could have ended so many different ways. I could have handed over that $1,200 without asking a single question, swallowing my hurt the way I always had, telling myself that peace was worth more than pride. I could have exploded in anger, cutting Vanessa out of my life entirely, punishing my son for staying silent those first few days, letting one painful season destroy years of real love that existed underneath the mess. Instead, I chose something harder than both of those options. I chose honesty. I chose to ask questions instead of assumptions, to demand truth instead of accepting convenient lies, and to hold people accountable while still leaving room for them to grow into better versions of themselves. That is not weakness. That is not softness. That is the quiet, unglamorous work of real family, the kind that doesn't get celebrated in movies or wedding toasts, but the kind that actually holds people together when everything else threatens to fall apart. To every person watching who has ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they matter less, that their presence is negotiable, that their love is a resource to be managed rather than a relationship to be honored, I want you to hear this. You are not responsible for teaching people how to treat you by silently accepting mistreatment. You teach people how to treat you by showing them, clearly and without apology, where your limits are. Sometimes that means a hard conversation at a dinner table. Sometimes it means sitting alone with your hurt for a few days before you're ready to speak. Sometimes it means loving someone enough to tell them the truth, even when a comfortable lie would be so much easier for everyone involved. I am not the same woman I was before that wedding, before that phone call, before that dinner where the truth finally came out over a pot roast that had fed this family for years. I am, I think, a better version of who I always should have been. Someone who understands that love and self-respect were never meant to compete with each other, that you can hold both at once, that giving generously to the people you love does not require erasing yourself in the process. My son and Vanessa are still building something new out of the wreckage of that season, still learning what honesty looks like in a marriage that almost broke under the weight of things left unsaid, and I am still learning too, learning what it means to be a mother and a mother-in-law who gives freely but never again silently, who loves deeply but never blindly, who shows up for her family exactly the way she always has but now, finally, expects to be shown up for in return. If this story reached you today, if some part of it felt familiar in your own life, I hope you walk away from it not with anger toward the people who have hurt you, but with a quiet, steady resolve to finally value yourself the way you have always valued everyone else. Because the truth is simple, even if living it out is hard, you can be generous and still have boundaries. You can be kind and still say no. You can forgive people and still hold them accountable for their actions. And you can love your family with your whole heart while still refusing to let that love be turned into a weapon against you. That is the lesson this season of my life taught me, one I carry with me now into every relationship I have left to build. And it is the lesson I hope, more than anything else, that you carry with you too. Because you deserve a family that shows up for you exactly as fully as you have always shown up for them, and it is never, ever too late to start expecting exactly that.